Today on the show, we are joined by Dr. Frank Lipman at Frank Lipman ND on Instagram. Today, we're going to be discussing Frank's amazing new book, The New Rules of Aging Well. So, Frank, when I was going through the book, what I really liked was that you break aging down into a kind of yin and yang concept. And I take this as kind of the yang is like the masculine tracking workouts, tracking the calories, the sleep, the fat, the blue blocking glasses, all that type of stuff. And the yin is the kind of the connection, the purpose, the community, the love, the rest, that type of thing. So I wonder, could you just sort of give us an overarching concept of aging, of aging well, that yin and yang type of side to it?
Right. Well, I mean, the only reason, I do think of things generally in terms of yin and yang, just from my training in Chinese medicine. But I just think as a culture, we in the West are too yang. We're too aggressive. It's all about pushing and going further and being the best you can. Whereas a lot of the older cultures, it's more about adapting and slowing down and taking care of your spirit, for lack of another term. So I talk of it in those terms because I think we are too driven in the West and too yang, and I think aging well is a combination of the two. I like to mix the wisdom from old traditions with the research and the new science, but being aware of the big picture, because it's not about being too yin or too yang. It's about a balance of both. And I just think I always stress the yin, because I think it's as important as I'm not against the tracking. I track my sleep. I'm not against exercising a lot, and I'm not against pushing oneself to a certain extent. But I think as a culture, we do that too much. I think it's good to balance it with the yin.
Yeah, I love that. I love that. So I devoured the book. I think it would be a great place if we sort of let's start with the yang. So I would love to just sort of talk about, in the book you mentioned that there are 20 longevity genes. I believe these are called situans. Not I'm a medical expert or anything. But before we delve into this, I wonder, could you just sort of give our audience, as we age, I assume that from when the day we're born, we start aging, what is actually happening to our cells as we get older?
Well, I'm not quite sure if we aging in a negative sense from when we're born. I mean, I actually like to see it. I sort of break it up into two areas. In the first part of our lives, maybe till we're 30 or 40, when we're aging, we want to grow and we want to build and we want to get strong and we want to reproduce. It's after the age of 40, it's more about maintaining. And that's sort of the why I bring that up, is because you talked about the longevity genes. We now, I mentioned earlier about using the latest research and combining it with this old wisdom. And we now know from research there are probably at least 20 genes that they've discovered that affect our aging. We have different genes that you can upregulate and downregulate by lifestyle for the most part. And 20 or so of them are what they're calling longevity genes. And then you get the gene regulators already, the sirtuins and the mTOR, mechanistic target of rapamycin, and AMPK. And when we're younger, for instance, the difference is you want to stimulate your mechanistic target of rapamycin, that longevity gene, or that longevity gene regulator, because that's the gene that's about growing strong and reproducing. So you want to stimulate that. But when you hit 40, or you're an old fart like me in your 60s, you don't want to stimulate that, because then you're stimulating cellular growth. And when you stimulate cellular growth, then you're also stimulating cellular waste. And one of the things that happens as you grow older, your self-cleansing mechanisms decrease or aren't as efficient. In fact, one of the things that happens as we get older is your functioning in general decreases. And one of the most important functions that decrease is your cleansing mechanisms. And so if you continue to stimulate growth, you're going to need to cleanse more as well. And because that mechanism isn't working as well, if you're going to stimulate cellular growth and your cleansing mechanisms aren't working well, you can stimulate cancers because you'll grow cancers. So that's the idea of not wanting to stimulate that particular longevity gene, as opposed to, you mentioned sirtuins and the AMK, those you do want to actually stimulate. Yeah.
Right. I find this really interesting. So as far as actually aging goes, I had a conversation with this about a friend. So in terms of the lifestyle factors, we don't have a choice of our genetics, but in terms of our diet, our exercise, our sleep, our connection, when it comes to aging well, how much of a factor does, those things which we control, what sort of effect could that, how many years could it add on? How big of a difference could it make?
Well, I think our genes that you're born with, most of them you can what we call upregulate or downregulate. In other words, you may be predisposed to heart disease or diabetes or cancers, but how you live your life will determine how those genes are expressed. And that's most of your genes. Now, there are a few genes that you can't change. Your genes for, brown hair or blue eyes or how tall you are. But most of your genes you can actually manipulate in a good or bad way. So what we call upregulate or downregulate. So I think most of the aging process is determined, or a lot of it, I'd say most of it is determined by our lifestyle. Now, it's important to realize that, because most of us, or we used to think that because you're born with this gene for cancer or this gene for heart disease, well, there's nothing you can do about it. We now know that there's a lot you can do about it. So I think it's important to realize that lifestyle makes a huge difference. But, and this is where the yin and maybe the yang comes in. Is it about just living longer, living to 120 or 130? Or is it about that's increasing your lifespan? Or is it rather about increasing your health span? How long you stay healthy and vital for before you just drop dead and snuff it. I want to be vital and healthy and do all the things I want to do, whether it's to 90 or 100 or 110, then just, drop dead in a day or a week or whatever. I don't want to suffer. So I think the idea is to actually, yes, increase your lifespan to a certain extent, but really increase your health span. Because the problem we have today is, what's the use of living to 100 if the last 20 years of your life you can't really get around properly, your mind is gone, you can't enjoy your grandchildren, you just can't enjoy your life. So it's about increasing your health span and your lifespan, but pay attention to that health span.
Yeah, David Sinclair, when he came on the show, he said that he wanted to live till 105, find a lump, and then be dead in a week.
Yes, I agree 100% with that. Yep.
I love it, man. So in the book, in
fact, the longevity genes, David talks about that in his book.
Yes.
He talks about the longevity genes. Yep.
Yes. And one of the things in which I've got in the book, which I really want to bring home for people here, is in the book you talk about this concept of hormesis.
Yes.
And small stresses which make you stronger. So I wonder, could you talk to us and sort of bring home this idea of hormesis and sort of how it works?
Sure. So there's that old saying, I think it's, I grew up in South Africa, and I grew up with it, so it's probably some English. It comes from somewhere in your neck of the woods. What doesn't kill you makes you stronger. And that's really what hormesis is. So we used to stress being bad for you, and chronic stress is bad for you. but short acute stresses on the body are actually very good for you. So for instance, fasting is a good example. If you don't eat for 14 or 16 hours, it's a bit of a stress on the body, and that stress stimulates some of these longevity gene regulators, the sirtuins, or it inhibits the mTOR. Interval training, so a little short burst of speed is, once again, is good for you. A sauna, extreme heat, or going from a sauna into a cold plunge, good for you. So these, you're having a very hot shower and ending off with a cold shower. So extreme temperature changes, another little stress on the body. So these little stresses on the body are actually very good for you. It's a long chronic stress, which is a problem. And that's what hormesis is. These acute short stresses that actually stimulate a positive response in the body.
Isn't this so interesting? Because in modern life, we know that there's a lot of sick people. And what do we do in modern life? We take the escalators, we overheat our homes, we take an Uber instead of working. It seems like more than ever we're afraid of discomfort.
No, absolutely. I think that's a major point. I mean, and it extends to almost everything we do. I think the idea of cleaning everything, for instance, or like, this hygiene hypothesis of baby, not letting your baby eat something off the floor, or not letting your dog lick your baby's face. All of this is actually getting these bacteria. We have this idea of all bugs are bad for you, and you want to live in this clean, pristine environment, but we're finding out that's not particularly good for your body's microbiome. So I think the way we live today is actually probably not that good for longevity, although, to a certain extent, it may help us from living in extreme conditions. But I think these short getting outside in the extreme cold. I don't know, does it get that cold in Wales? I'm not sure. It does. Yeah, it's damp, right?
It rains a lot here,
yeah. But yeah, I think we've forgotten a lot of the wisdom that we should have sort of learned from a lot of old cultures. Maybe more so in America because it's such a young culture. But I think all cultures have so much wisdom, and we don't really respect that or take enough or pay enough attention to that. I mean, I don't know enough about the Welsh culture, so I can't really comment. But all these old cultures there's so much wisdom there that we tend to ignore.
Completely agree, man. Let's touch on diet a bit. And one thing that your book really hits home for is that a huge factor in aging well is simply eating less. So I wonder, could you sort of double click on this? Why should we eat less?
Yeah, I think once again, it sort of comes down to this concept of well, first of all, we eat too much as a culture, as a general rule. Anyway, in America, in particular, probably less so in Wales, but definitely in America, and it comes back to that same concept of autophagy I was talking about, the body's self-cleansing mechanism. Because, when you eat, your body has to process everything, and there's always going to be cellular waste. And as you get older, this process of autophagy, the cleansing mechanisms decrease. So the less, stress you put on those mechanisms, the less hard your body has to work, the easier it is for it. So, the two things, you don't need as much food as you're eating. And secondly, the more you eat, the excess you eat, it's just extra work for your body to cleanse, to clean out the cells per se. So it's less, I just think it's important to, you got to adapt as you get older. And this is where, why I talk about the yin. It's fine to push yourself and get bigger and stronger when you're younger. But when you get into your 40s and 50s, that's not good for your body, because your body, you know, there's a decrease in general function, and we've got to just accept it. It's just what it is. So if you keep pushing yourself, including the digestive processes and the processes that have to metabolize the food you put in, it's just more work on the body. And why do you want to do that?
Yeah, this is a really interesting topic, because I remember, growing up in a family, you're sitting at the table, your parents want you to be full, they want you to have starters, they want you to have desserts. And one of the things in which, in my house anyway, we were really big on was breakfast. I was always told
Right.
breakfast is the most important meal of the day. And a few years ago, when I started intermittent fasting and I would skip breakfast, even 3 or 4 years ago, people would say, "You're crazy.
Yeah.
Breakfast is the most important meal of the day." I wonder, what are your thoughts on breakfast being the most important meal of the day?
Well, now I don't think. I think it's an unnecessary meal. So, but I used to believe that too, like everyone. In fact, I used to teach my patients to do. I used to, even my older books, I used to talk about breakfast being the most important meal of the day. And if you want to have a stable blood sugar, you need to have breakfast. So yes, I, being even a holistic doctor, was promoting that idea. So I'm guilty of that too. But I, like you, have been, not having breakfast for the last number of years, and it's great. And it's actually, now we know there's a ton of science actually documenting that, time restricted eating, which is sort of basically eating dinner earlier and breakfast later. So eating all your calories, which obviously you know about because this is your thing, but eating all your calories in a, let's say an 8-hour time period, and fasting for the 16 hours is actually very good for your body, because once again, it stimulates autophagy, it stimulates those longevity genes. That's all the good. It's, apart from you feeling great, I mean, I feel so clear. I mean, I love it. I wasn't even a coffee drinker really, but now, I have a cup of black coffee in the morning, and I'm so clear and sharp in the morning without breakfast. To me, it's like a no-brainer for anyone who wants to age well. I mean, I think for some people, especially people who are used to having lots of carbohydrates in their food, that's a little bit difficult in the beginning. But for most people, especially as you get older, I think it's like a no-brainer. Now, there are a couple of contraindications. I do see often younger women who actually sort of in their 30s, occasionally in their 40s, but younger women who want to have babies, I don't necessarily recommend it unless they want to lose weight for a short period. But for anyone over 40, over 50, it's a no-brainer. I mean, why wouldn't we just do that? And it's actually, as you can attest to, once you start doing it, it's like, it's so easy. It just becomes a way of life. And that actually is one of the easiest ways to eat less. I mean, I just eat 2 meals. Instead of 3 meals, I eat 2 meals, and I'm not hungry. I don't need all that much food. So I do think this, we have so many bad habits in our Western culture that we've adapted to this new way of living. And because there's excess of everything, there's just food you can get at any time. It's not particularly good for our aging mechanisms.
I love that, man. I love that. And in terms of intermittent fasting, I mean, one of the main things which I experience and the people I speak to talk about is that just by giving up food, say 3 hours before bed, I mean, the difference which this makes to sleep. I mean, I was
Yes.
always a nighttime binger, but it's night and day, no pun intended, different.
No, it makes a huge difference. I do believe, because I'm very into the rhythms in, body rhythms. Ideally, if you can actually have your last meal around 3 o'clock, that's probably even better. But that's very difficult for to fit into our lifestyles. But I would imagine I strongly believe, I don't do it myself because it's just too inconvenient. We've got families we've got to eat with. But ideally, I mean, if you can eat your last dinner at 3 and then when you break your fast is around 7, it's probably better. But for most of us, you eat your last dinner at 6 or 7 and then you eat again at 11 or 12. It's so easy. It's like so easy to do. That's one of the things in my practice we do a lot. And, people, first of all, people who don't know look at you as if you're crazy first. And they say, as you said, but breakfast is the most important meal. But when they come back and they start doing it, they love it. I have very few patients who've told me who haven't really started it and just find it really helpful, from weight loss to, I do measure a lot of biomarkers in my office. So we do a lot of blood tests, and it's unbelievable the changes that the metabolic changes you see with simple things like fasting. It's like very, very interesting. And it's like it's a no-brainer. You can do it. It's cheap because you're actually probably saving money on food, and anyone can do it. So I love it. I'm a huge, huge fan.
This is really interesting. So from what we've talked about, we know that fasting can activate autophagy,
Yep.
which can strengthen our immune system. Is it a case that, because I just want to clarify this question, we've got a lot of type A personalities that listen to the show. We've got a lot of driven people. Is there a case that the longer is better with fasting? Is there a limit? What's the sort of science on that?
Well, okay, so no one really knows, but the type A people will think so. My clinical experience, because I have type A people in my practice, is it doesn't seem to make that much difference to their biomarkers when we measure them. In fact, we have people who there's this fairly popular in America, that people do this fasting mimicking diet. Because I have a lot of type A people in New York who want something that's easy. And the fasting mimicking diet gives them this shitty food for 5 days. We've actually created stuff in my office where my health coaches develop, recipes for some soups and salads. But you do 5 days of eating, I think, less than 1,200 calories, no animal protein, very low carb, sort of low protein. People do that for 5 days a month, and they still get good results on their biomarkers. So I've never seen bigger changes from more fasting. I don't think that's necessary. I think, like most things, if you can make anything a habit and it becomes something that you do regularly, that's more important than having to fast for 6 days or whatever you do. Now, if you have a serious medical condition, that may be different. But to reverse metabolic problems, to reverse prediabetes, to reverse a lot of the common problems that we have, whether it's, people have to lose weight or mild hypertension, or, just to age better and changing people's biomarkers, I don't see a big difference from fasting more. That's been my clinical experience.
Yeah, you mentioned sugar, not sugar, but that's where I was going. You mentioned pre-diabetes. I know David Perlmutter, who actually he's on the back of the book. He was
David's a good friend. Yeah, he's great. Have you had him on your show?
We have, yes. He's
great.
He's a wonderful man, David is. And he mentioned on the show that if someone is drinking a couple of sugary drinks a day, then they are likely to be pre-diabetic. So I wonder, how bad is sugar? And I'm not talking about from fruits, but just, the sort of refined sugars and whatnot for us.
It's the devil. It's probably the worst thing for us. Sugar is the devil. There's no question about it. Sugar is a drug. The metabolic consequences of, first of all, it's a drug and you become addictive and it's very hard to give up. But besides that, the metabolic consequences of eating sugar are really detrimental to your health. I mean, sugar is also the precursor, triggers inflammation, which is then the precursor of all our chronic diseases of today, whether it's heart disease, diabetes, obesity, cancer, osteoporosis, Alzheimer's, you name it. sugar is like to me, the biggest culprit for poor aging. There's nothing that comes close. Sugar, when I talk about sugar, I'm talking about sugar, processed foods, starchy foods. You guys got to get rid of all those potato chips. But anything that turns into sugar is bad news. Now, the part of the problem also is as we get older, our capacity to metabolize carbohydrates decreases. So when you're younger, you can have that crap. I'm not saying it's good for you, and your body can process it. But as you get older, that capacity to process the carbohydrates and the sugar in particular decreases. So you get more prone to metabolic syndrome, pre-diabetes, insulin resistance, and then the problem is downstream is the sugar dysregulation, and then it creates from predisposition to poorer outcomes with COVID, to hypertension, heart disease, diabetes, obesity, Alzheimer's, you name it, cancer. So, but the sugar dysregulation is that problem downstream, and it's a commonest problem we see today.
Yeah.
And our culture promotes it. The corporate, the food industry, which is not particularly, they're not worried about your health. They're more worried about their financial health, are putting out these unhealthy foods. So it takes a lot of effort to be healthy in this day and age, unfortunately.
Yeah. And I think that health is kind of a thing where we often think about it in terms of being reactive. We sit back and wait for illness to kick in, but I think it's one of the things we've got to be proactive.
Absolutely. And your generation's much better. I mean, I love it. When David Perlmutter and I have been doing this a long time. When we were doing this in the 80s, 90s, or I know David from probably 30 years ago.
Wow.
When we were starting to do functional medicine, people thought we were quacks. Now we're gurus. But we've been saying the same thing all the time. You got to catch things. The earlier you catch something, the easier it is to reverse. And if you start, make a lot of these lifestyle changes, habits, then life becomes much easier. It's harder to reverse when you're older.
What's your opinion on meat?
Okay, I'm not against well-sourced meat, grass-fed, grass-finished meat. I'm not against meat. I coming from South Africa in particular, but what I would say is I used to eat a lot of meat. What I would say, I eat less meat now. I eat less animal protein than I used to. Not that I'm against animal protein. And that's because we now know that animal protein has high levels of methionine in particular, which is an amino acid, which is, and branched chain amino acids, which are actually good for growth. So if you want to grow strong, animal protein is good. But for the aging process, it's not so good because it stimulates the mTOR, the mechanistic target of rapamycin. So I suggest, and I've done it myself, when you get once you start getting to your 40s and 50s in particular, to decrease animal protein. But I still eat animal protein, but instead of once or twice a day, I probably have it once every second day or something. So it's not that I'm against it. I do think you've got to watch, once you get into your 60s, you've got to watch your muscle loss. And there's something called sarcopenia, same as we have osteopenia, which is a loss of bone. You get sarcopenia, which is a loss of muscle. So it's a fine balance, because the best thing for muscle is actually animal protein. So it's this fine balance as you get older. But I think cutting back, if you're eating a lot of animal protein, is probably a good idea as you get older. But yeah. I'm not against animal protein.
Yeah, I'll definitely come back to the muscle one. I'm going to come back to that. The animal protein one is interesting, because in the book, I know that you say something like eggs are a natural multivitamin.
Yeah, I love eggs.
Yeah, you love it. So eggs can be good. Eggs can be good.
Yeah, I mean, this is the thing. Eggs are good. Eggs are good. I'm not saying eggs are good. I'm not. This is the one area that it's a very, very you know, it's very nuanced, and it's hard to say what is actually right. All I can say is I love eggs. I think eggs are wonderful. I'm not against red meat at all. I just think once we get older, too much of it. I mean, I could have eggs every day. And I'm not against eggs because of the cholesterol. I'm just saying too much animal protein, eggs included, because of the composition of amino acids, is not particularly good for that longevity gene regulator mTOR that we're talking about. That's all. You know, how significant that is, we don't really know. You know, a lot of us are just making assumptions. You know, I have some patients who eat meat all the time and are feeling great. So, you know, I don't know, when it comes to animal protein and getting older, I think there is quite a bit of debate, but I sit in the middle that, you know, you don't have to stop it, but probably decrease it.
Yeah, that seems like a very sensible thing. So if we, you know, there's been some very good takes on diet here. I would love to just sort of wrap this up and just say, so we know as we get older, we might want to sort of decrease our sort of meat intake. As you mentioned, you sort of look to eat meat maybe once every other day or so. Are there some other general diet tips which you've got which could help us age well?
Well, the best thing is stop sugar. I mean, a low carb diets, I think, would be universal. You know, I don't give a shit what people say about. I mean, here I'm prepared to go. You know, some people talk about high carbs, but for most, you know, and there is no one right diet. I don't think there's one right diet, but I think cutting back on your sugar, processed foods, refined carbs in particular, probably your carbs in general, or your grains, if you want to get your carbs, get it from vegetables, is probably a good idea, because you know, high carbohydrate diets also stimulate mTOR and inhibit the other longevity genes which you don't want to inhibit. So I think a low carb diet is a good idea. You know, after that it becomes trickier, because some people do better on a higher fat diet. Some people need a little bit more protein. So after that, I think it does become trickier. I do find once you're fasting and you're only eating 2 meals a day, it seems to be less of a problem. You know, so I'll have a soup for 1 meal, and, you know, it doesn't seem to be such an issue when you know, I'm not worried about having to decrease my eggs, because I'm not having eggs every morning for breakfast, which is what I used to have. So it does make it easier when you're only eating 2 meals a day.
Yeah, man. I love that. I want to come back to the muscle one. So you mentioned that muscle is important as we age. What role does muscle play in aging well?
Well, so muscle's important because not only is it important for moving around and preventing disability, which is very common with aging, but muscle is a metabolic organ. I mean, if you want to control your sugar, you need a good amount of muscle. So you need to see having good muscles as a way of actually helping you metabolize sugar as well. So muscle is a metabolic organ. And if you want metabolic health and you want to manage your carbohydrates, your blood sugar, you need a good amount of muscle. So it's important to realize that muscles don't just help you move around and lift things and be more functional, which is very important, because that is a problem as you get older, but it's also helping you with your sugar metabolism. And it's just a metabolic, or you've got to see muscle as another metabolic organ.
Really interesting. I noticed that you were wearing an aura ring, which you showed earlier.
You know, I think, and you know, yeah, I think I sort of monitor my sleep in terms of patterns, just because I like experimenting. As you point out, I've noticed, and I probably knew it, but it's better to measure it. I've noticed patterns when I have a little bit too much dark chocolate after dinner. I may not sleep as well. When I eat earlier, I sleep better. CBD seems to help my deep sleep more. So I play around with it. When I sauna, in the morning, I seem to sleep better. So there, you notice patterns. I think the Aura Ring or monitoring your sleep can be helpful to determine patterns and what seems to help or not. And that's how I use it with my patients in my practice, rather than telling them to look that, well, I got 1.5 hours of deep sleep and an X amount of REM sleep. It's what I recommend to people with the Aura Ring is to make some changes and actually see what the patterns are. Stop drinking alcohol. I'm not an alcohol drinker, but the classic example is people stop drinking alcohol and they'll come back and they're, oh my God, my sleep is so much better. Or, as you point out, people who eat earlier seem to sleep better. So I think the Aura Ring and sleep trackers, because this is just one of them, are helpful to delineate patterns. And sleep is one of those keys for aging well. So I'm all for tracking, self-tracking. I just, as you pointed out in the beginning about Tu Yang, some people are a little bit too obsessed with tracking, and then they start freaking out that they're not sleeping well. They get more stressed, and then it makes their sleep work. So you just got to be smart about all these things.
Man, I'm loving this. What are some things which you've done? You mentioned the CBD, you mentioned the sauna, that you do, that you incorporate for a great night's sleep.
Well, I find the things that, if I am meditating regularly, if I'm, when I'm in a groove, and, it depends, when I'm working, if I'm in a groove of, meditating in the morning, getting outside and getting early morning light and exercising outside, now that it's winter, I'll ride my Peloton bike inside. But when I go outside in the morning, early morning, and I ride, and I come, we'll put it this way: the best sleep that I find is if I get up and I meditate in the morning, I go for a ride outside, I have a sauna. I mean, but this is the idyllic life. I can't do it all the time. And I eat earlier. I mean, then my sleep is fantastic. So all these little things seem to help it. But to be realistic, I have to work and I can't go riding outside every day. But I do find meditation helps a lot. Eating earlier and not having, I try and have just a little bit of dark chocolate. I love my dark chocolate, so I'll just have a little bit. That helps. Even if I have too much fruit, because I love fruit, even if I have too much fruit after dinner, it affects my sleep. What else? I take magnesium every night. I just take magnesium every night. So I don't know if it helps or does. I think it does, but I've been taking magnesium every night for so long that I don't even know what it would do if I didn't take it. But CBD, I got to say, when I'm a little bit stressed or I know there's too much going on, I pop my CBD and I find that it really is helpful. I mean, I'm a big fan of CBD. For me, it works. Doesn't work for everyone, but I know if I'm a little bit agitated or if I've given a talk too late and my mind is too active, I have the think, if I slug down some CBD, it sort of really knocks me out, which is great.
Love to hear that, man. So I figured so far, I mean, we've absolutely smashed through the yang side. I mean, we've gone through so many diet tips, and we've gone through sleep, and we've gone through what's happening to the cells. Let's look at the sort of the yin side, and how important then in aging is things like love, passion, purpose, connection.
So I believe, and the older I get, the more important I think these things are. And whether it's they're intangible, they're hard to measure. I wish I had an Oura ring to measure if I have more gratitude, if I'm more more forgiveness, if I'm kinder, how much it helps. But just from noticing patients, there's no question in my mind, and I don't need research to show me this. I mean, the patients of mine, I've seen so many patients over so many years. The patients of mine who really do well are people who have meaning in their lives, who have a purpose, And, the meaning or their purpose could be their kids. Doesn't have to be changing the world. It can be anything that's meaningful for them. But when people have that, when they have a community, when they're grateful for what they have, when they're not, holding on to bitterness and anger, and they're able to let go and forgive, I've definitely noticed that those people, are thriving more, even if they're eating, their diets aren't perfect and they're not exercising as much. I just find, when I look at, when I think about it and I see my patients who are aging, those patients who have those aspects together, which are hard, you can't tell someone to go have gratitude or be kind to people. You can't tell them, but people who who embrace those, what are they? Embrace those. They're not really habits, or those changes seem to do better. People. So, is there research? It probably is some research. I mean, the more I look into the stuff, there's always stuff coming out on community and loneliness and even compassion. I know, David, I don't know if you've spoken to David recently. His latest book is Brainwash. I don't know if you've talked to him about
Yeah, talked to him about that one. Yeah.
A lot of it is, he talks a lot about that, and actually how the microbiome affects that. But I do believe strongly that those intangibles, those yin aspects of how we live our life, are as important, if not more important. I have so many, many males who are so driven, and they're tracking everything, and they think they're eating the right way, and they're pushing their body, and they're exercising, and they're not happy. They're like, just trying to get better and better. And a lot of those people, don't do as well as the people who learn to just adapt and be with who they are, and are comfortable with their lives. And so I do think it's a balance of yin and yang. I do think you need to eat well and exercise and pay attention to your sleep and deal with your, so it's a real balance between these yin and yang aspects.
Man, I love that. And it was interesting, earlier we talked about how sort of modern health has become coddled. We take the escalators, we sit in our heated homes. It also seems like in the modern world that we've kind of lost the art of connection, social media and whatnot. Do you think that we've lost the art of connecting with one another in the modern world?
I don't know if we've lost the art. I just think it's harder. You got to, especially now with COVID, but you got to just pay more attention to it. I mean, when I think of how we grew up in South Africa, community was just part of how we grew up. I don't know what happens in Wales, so I can't really comment. But in America, it's very different. When I grew up in South Africa, all of all the kids who lived near each other, we all used to go play at the park down the road. There was just so much more community. There was family coming in and out. There was just automatic. It was just normal. Those things don't really happen in this day and age here in America. It's much harder. You've got to pay much more attention to it. So I think it's just the way we live our lives has made it more difficult. Maybe because everyone is working so hard and they're trying to get ahead, and there's less. I think it was just more automatic, where community and extended family and extended community was just part of our lives, and it's not now. When I worked in initially, when I finished my training in South Africa, I went to work up in the bush in one of the homelands, Kwandebele. And so I was sort of exposed to the Ndebele and how they lived. And, you just see how people, the community, everything's communal. And we don't really have that as much today. So it's harder. And I do think it's important. I think, not that I'm religious fanatics are not necessarily a good thing, but I think religion has a lot of positive aspects in terms of community, which are good for, people are maybe are attracted to that because of the community, which I think is very helpful. I mean, I do think wherever you can create some community, a community where you relate to, like, I assume what you're doing with your podcast is creating some type of community. So it's not that you can't do it, it's just a little bit different. I think community and finding people who sort of think like you feel comfortable around, is really important for health and aging in particular. Yeah.
Yeah, and it's interesting because we mentioned the yin and the yang. In tough times, when we lose a loved one, when we go through a setback,
Exactly.
when we lose a job, who do we turn to?
Exactly.
My Fitbit doesn't keep me company when I'm going through
Right.
the tough times. I
Right.
turn to the people that I love and that I care about.
Exactly. And I think we shouldn't forget that. I think that's so important. I really, I'm I've always been a big proponent, but especially as you get older and wiser, because you see, you're observing a lot. I just think these are the aspects of our society that we really need to try and remedy, because the individual, the society that pushes the individual per se and not the community has some positives. I'm not saying it's all bad, but if you forget about the whole communal aspect of growing up together and aging together, it's we put old people in old age homes, as opposed to, we all used to live in one roof. And I think, yeah, we need to not, we need to try and remember some of the aspects of these old cultures that I think are powerful and healing.
I completely agree. So today we've been discussing the new rules of aging. Well, there'll be a link for this book and everything in the description. I just got one last question for you on this book before I just fire through quick fire ones, which we ask at the end of the podcast. The everybody wants a magic pill. Supplements. Do you recommend any? What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I'm a big fan of supplements. I used to get a hard time for recommending supplements. I mean, the important thing is supplements supplement a good diet. I don't just think supplements out of context. I think supplements can be incredibly helpful. I take a shitload of supplements. You've had, what's his name?
Sinclair.
Sinclair. I mean, he's a big proponent of NMR, or
metformin.
I take dinucleotide riboside. I mean, I take it. I take curcumin. I take coenzyme Q10. I take alpha lipoic. I mean, I take a lot of supplements, but the way I use it in my practice is very targeted. They actually, I go by people's blood results. Some people need more vitamin D than other people. Some people need more magnesium. So I have it very targeted. And then we also do genetic testing, nutritional genetic testing in my office, where you can really sort of plug in where people are weak. So some people will come up with poor detoxification pathways, or prone to vascular health problems. So we can now target supplements according to, really personalize it. So yes, I'm a huge fan of supplements. I think if they're done in a targeted way and done wisely, they are very helpful. Now, supplements become expensive. There's so many things that are free and cheap and that you can do anyway. But I think if you want to put the cherry on top, then I think supplements are very helpful.
My man, I like it. So a couple of quick fire ones which I got for you, which we ask at the end of every conversation. So we've discussed your fantastic book today. What books that you've read have impacted your life?
I would say some meditation books. Let's look. I'll tell you now.
It's a big bookshelf. I like it.
I would say Light on Yoga by BKS Iyengar, which is a really good one. I would say where is Full Catastrophe Living, which was that was many years ago by John Kabat-Zinn, which turned me on to meditation. It was sort of a Western explanation of meditation. That has been really helpful. What else? You know, in the old days, I mean, it's changed. I mean, as Between Heaven and Earth was probably one of the most instrumental books in the way I think. That's when they became my Chinese medicine teachers, Ephraim Korngold and Harriet Bainfeld. You should have them on sometime before they so yeah, Between Heaven and Earth. What else? I mean, it's hard to say with nutrition because you know, things have changed. What else? Okay, I don't know. Isn't that enough?
That's awesome, man. That's awesome. I like it, man. My last question for you today, before tell these guys where they can connect with you, is what makes a life worth living?
I think, you know, having purpose and meaning, you know, whatever that is for you. Now, as I said earlier, it could be just your children, but, you know, if you got a purpose and you know, I have what is meaningful for me is trying to change the way we see the world, you know, not only from a health perspective, but I think a life worth living is having meaning and purpose, being kind to yourself, being kind to others, and being kind to the world, to the earth. So you know, we are microcosms of this macrocosm. You know, to think that we can just do whatever we want to planet Earth and not expect negative consequences is. So we've got to just be aware of how we treat the world, how we treat others, and how we treat ourselves.
That was a beautiful answer. As I mentioned, we've been discussing your book, The New Rules of Aging Well. We'll be giving away one copy of this book. I will put a link below to our Instagram. Can you tell these guys where they can connect with you and if you've got any closing messages for them or maybe about the book?
Sure. So I have a website, drfranklipman.com, Dr. Frank Lipman. We put out great blogs and a free newsletter every week. And then I'm on Twitter at Dr. Frank Lipman. I'm on Instagram. My health coach does the Instagram at Frank Lipman MD. But yeah, but my newsletter is pretty good. I'll have this will go in. Every week I send out, you know, whether it's podcasts or whatever, and great articles. We put out great stuff every week.
Man, I absolutely loved your book. I've been listening to a few of your podcasts lately. It has been a real pleasure speaking to you. I've really enjoyed it. I hope it was worth missing the football game for. But I really enjoyed it, man. Thank you so much for coming on the show.
Okay, thanks. Thank you.